Good morning and welcome to American History. We are still in the relatively same time period around 1865 to 1901 with industrialization. So, we're going to talk about how the United States changes from a predominantly agricultural type country to an industrialized country and even surpasses Great Britain as number one economically. So your timeline that you should have copied down on your vocabulary is here. You've got, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. We've got Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone, Thomas Edison with the light bulb. We've got a lot of trusts, a lot of riots, and a lot of strikes as a result of monopolies over certain industries. So we'll talk about that and why monopolies are not good. So American business and industry grows very rapidly at the end of the Civil War. We had a lot of factories that were created to create uniforms for soldiers and weapons for the war. So by 1914, the nation's gross national product, or the value of all goods and services produces, was 8 times greater than it had been in 1865, if that tells you anything. So a lot of the growth is due to natural resources. It's due to a large workforce. We have new inventions, and we have the introduction of the free enterprise system. So number one, the natural resources, most of them come from out west. So we've just settled the West, and we talked about a lot of like the mining that's going on out west. Coal, iron, and copper are major industries out west. We also have the timber industry that, like we have forests all over the place. So timber is a major industry as well. So settling the West and the Transcontinental Railroad helped accelerate industrialization. Petroleum is also really high demand because it could be turned into kerosene, and that fueled lanterns and stoves. Edwin Drake drills the first oil well near Titusville, PA, and by 1900, we have oil fields from Pennsylvania to Texas. So the large workforce obviously comes from better living conditions because our population triples almost from 1860 to 1910. So we get better living conditions, which means that children actually survive to adulthood, where that was not as possible or not as common before. And you also have a flood of immigrants coming into the country to escape oppressive governments or to escape religious persecution or whatever, to start a new life, to get for opportunity and what have you. So the population growth not only provides a workforce, but it also creates a demand for consumer goods manufactured by the factories. So one of our inventors that we'll talk about is Alexander Graham Bell, and he is known for basically creating the telephone. So this revolutionizes business and personal communication. He organizes the Bell Telephone Company, which eventually becomes American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T. Most people know what AT&T is. Hopefully you understand what AT&T is. That's just what it stands for. And it all is here because of Alexander Graham Bell. So thank you, Alexander, for our telephone companies, or the beginning of telephones. Thomas Edison, on the other hand, he's known as the wizard at Menlo Park. He supposedly patents more than 1,000 inventions. He first achieves international fame in 1877 with the invention of the phonograph. So he kind of gets on the stage at that point. 2 years later, he perfects the electric generator. He perfects the light bulb. He doesn't invent them. He perfects them. In his laboratory, then invents or improves several other major devices like the battery, the dictaphone, the motion picture. Thomas Edison transforms American society whenever they start supplying power to New York City, which is cool, awesome, pretty major contribution. In 1889, Edison companies merge and form the Edison General Electric Company, known as GE today. And they are known as like one of the larger electric companies. So way to go, Thomas Edison. Now, notice that I said he perfected, or he improved a lot of major devices. He invents a lot of things, but he also, he patents a lot of inventions, but he doesn't actually invent as many inventions as it seems. He kind of steals a lot of stuff from other people. I'm not going to get into it too much, but he's not really the greatest. Not as big of a fan of him. So George Westinghouse is an engineer and industrialist, and he invents an air brake system for railroads. So before he invents this air brake system, you had to use a manual system that required brakes to be applied to each car, like each railroad car separately. And so it took a lot longer to slow trains down and get them to stop. Westinghouse provided a continuous braking system so that all the car's brakes were applied at the same time. So this is really, it makes railroads a lot safer. They could brake rapidly and smoothly, and would allow trains to travel safely at higher speeds. So Westinghouse also develops an alternating current system to distribute electricity using transformers and generators. Now, Thomas Edison is competing with Westinghouse. He doesn't like Westinghouse and sets out to prove Westinghouse wrong. And so to prove that alternating current system is dangerous, he electrocutes Topsy the elephant and videos it for everyone to see it, and for the most part, tries to defame Westinghouse. Thankfully, Westinghouse's electric company, it lights up Chicago's Columbia exhibition in 1893, and it's also the first to use hydroelectric power at Niagara Falls to generate electricity for streetcars and lights in Buffalo, New York. So Westinghouse is still successful. I'm not going to get into the alternating current too much, but I will let you know that, Edison was kind of a jerk to him and tried to defame him. So here he is. He's known for the alternating system. This is his electric company. So Thaddeus Lowe invents the ice machine, which is the basis of the refrigerator. In early 1870, Swift is the founder of Swift Meatpacking, and he actually engineers a refrigerated railroad car, he hires an engineer to help develop a refrigerated railroad car, which is awesome because then we could ship meat and different food products from one side of the country to the other without the food going bad, and it reduced the risk of food poisoning. The Northrop automatic loom allows cloth to be made at a much faster rate and allows bobbins to be changed automatically. You have power-driven sewing machines and cloth cutters that rapidly move clothing businesses from small tailor shops to larger factories. Cyrus Field lays a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean in 1866 so that we can contact Europe instantaneously instead of having to wait for weeks at a time for messages to get back and forth. So that's another improvement. Basically, technology is just it's awesome. Like anything can still be invented today, but this really leads us into a new modern age in society. So the free enterprise system, hopefully you remember a little bit about the free enterprise system from economics, but in the late 1800s, a lot of Americans were embracing the idea of laissez-faire, which basically meant to let the people do as they choose. So they believe the government shouldn't interfere in the economy other than to protect private property rights and maintain peace. The government, if it regulates the economy, it increases costs and will hurt society. It relies on the supply and demand for setting prices rather than the government. And to regulate wages and prices, the free market with competing companies leads to greater efficiency and creates more wealth for everyone. So I'm recording. Go away. I got it. Thank you. So free enterprise also supports low taxes and limited government debt to ensure that private individuals, not the government, will make most of the decisions about how the nation's wealth is spent. So the profit motive attracts a lot of people into business. Entrepreneurs are attracted by the prospect of making money. And so they start investing in these companies and they start investing in railroads. Foreign investors from Great Britain also see great opportunities for profit in the United States. And so you have a lot of other countries wanting to invest in our companies. So state and federal governments keep taxes and spending low, and they don't impose costly regulations on industry or control wages or prices too much. So the government kind of backs off and lets everyone kind of produce their own goods at their own rates. And the government mostly just plays a role in introducing policies to promote business. Northern leaders wanted high tariffs to protect manufacturers from foreign competition. Southern leaders opposed subsidies and favored low tariffs to promote trade and to keep the cost of imported goods low. Because whenever you raise taxes on imported goods, then those countries are going to raise taxes to import your goods. And so it kind of like shuts down international trade. So the Morrill tariff actually shut down international trade quite a bit because this is a tariff that raised taxes overseas. The northern states did this while the southern states had seceded during the Civil War, and so they didn't really have a say-so in this. Congress also gives a lot of Western land and nearly $65 million in loans to Western railroads, and they sell public lands with mineral resources for a lot cheaper than their market value during this time. So when the U.S. raises tariffs on foreign goods, other countries raise tariffs on American goods. So that hurts our companies that are trying to sell goods abroad, especially farmers who sell their products, a lot of their products overseas. So Congress believed that the tariffs were necessary because they wanted Americans to be able to improve their products so that they could actually compete with countries overseas. And so they actually are not able to, they don't, change the tariff rates or anything like that. They just, they continue to keep the tariffs high, and it really hurts international trade, and it hurts the markets for farmers as well in the South. So a lot of your major railroads, including the Transcontinental Railroad, were constructed really quickly after the Civil War ended. A railroad boom starts in 1862. That's when Lincoln signs the Pacific Railway Act, and that's whenever the start of the Transcontinental Railroad, that's when it begins. So basically, he wants the Pacific Railway to provide the construction of a transcontinental railroad by two corporations. He's going to have each company get land on either side of the railroad tracks, and they can do what they want with that land. They can sell it for profit. They could, use it for their own interest, whatever. And basically, he's like, the more land that you get, the more profit that you can make. And so a lot of these companies are like, he's wanting the production of the railroad to be quick. And so by doing that, it creates kind of like this really speedily constructed railroad. As you see here, you have the two companies, the Union Pacific that begins over here, and then you have the Central Pacific. And then later on, we'll add in this little piece here. And so basically these two railroad points meet in the middle, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But this is the Transcontinental Railroad. It goes all the way across the continent. We already had railroads in the east, so that's why it doesn't connect all the way to the East Coast. So the Union Pacific is under the direction of engineer Grenville Dodge. The Union Pacific begins pushing westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The laborers face blizzards in the mountains, scorching heat in the desert, and sometimes angry Native Americans. So they're working on, and a lot of the men who are working are Civil War veterans. They're Irish immigrants. They're miners. They're farmers. They're cooks. They're adventurers. They're ex-cons. It's just a whole different, a whole conglomeration of different types of men that are working on these railroads. At its height, the Union Pacific employed over 10,000 workers. Equipment had to be shipped along the Missouri River so that they could get their supplies quickly. Camp life was rough, it was dirty, and it was dangerous. There's a lot of gambling, a lot of hard drinking, and a lot of fighting. So it's definitely a manly atmosphere. Now, the Central Pacific, on the other hand, begins as the dream of engineer Theodore Judah. He sells stock to four Sacramento merchants, which are Leland Stanford, Charlie Crocker, and Mark Hopkins and Collis Huntington. These big four eventually made huge fortunes because Stanford became governor, and Stanford becomes governor of California and serves as a U.S. senator, and then eventually founds Stanford University. So, he's a grocer. He starts out as a grocer, then he makes his money off the railroad, and then eventually kind of works his way up. And y'all have probably heard of Stanford University. Because of the shortage of labor in California, the Central Pacific Railroad actually hires about 10,000 workers from China. They pay them $1 a day, and they're doing some of the world's like most dangerous work. All their equipment had to be shipped from the eastern U.S., either around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, or over the Isthmus of Panama in Central America, because it's just faster to transport these goods by waterway. So their goods are going all the way around the ocean, like through the ocean. Takes them a little bit longer to get their supplies. So workers completed the Transcontinental Railroad in only 4 years, which is like extremely quick for such a large feat. Think of how long they've been working on the interstates in West Memphis, and how long it's taken them to work on the interstate here in Jonesboro even. So anyway, each mile of track required 400 rails. Each rail took 10 spikes. So you have to imagine these men hammering in these spikes over and over and over and over and over again. It's a very tedious task. The Central Pacific laid a total of 688 miles of track, and the Union Pacific laid 1,086 miles. On May 10th, 1869, hundreds of spectators gathered at Promontory Summit, Utah, to watch dignitaries hammer 5 gold and silver spikes into the final rails that would join the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. So it was a really cool time. It was a really big event. People came out, like newspaper journalists came out to like photograph the event. After Leland Stanford hammered in the last spike, telegraph operators sent the news across the nation. And so like everybody knew, like simultaneously there's cannons blasting in New York City. Chicago has a parade. Citizens in Philadelphia ring the Liberty Bell. Like everybody is just celebrating because it's, this great accomplishment. And this is one of the pictures that was taken at the meeting. So here's a firsthand account, from General Grenville Dodge. He says, the trains pulled up facing each other, each crowded with workmen. The officers and invited guests formed on each side of the track. Prayer was offered. A number of spikes were driven into 2 adjoining rails, and thus the 2 roads were welded into one great trunk line from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So obviously a major feat. Now the Chinese, I want you to know the Chinese that they hire. This isn't really like in my slides. There's a video link that you can watch that will tell about it. But they are hired to come over because we look at them and we're like, they built the Great Wall of China. Like they're kind of like beasts. So they could help build this railroad through the mountains. And we put them in charge of like nitroglycerin, which is a highly like reactive material that they use to blast through the mountains. And so a lot of them are like, they're working for $1 a day. And that's why I say they're doing very, very dangerous work, especially like tunneling through the mountains. So keep that in mind also, because we're going to talk about the Chinese here in a little bit as well. So the railroads do spur growth. Obviously the Transcontinental Railroad creates a quicker passage to the west, and it makes markets and goods obviously more accessible to people who are living out in the west. So it's the first of many lines that start crisscrossing the nation after the Civil War. Railroads increase the markets for a lot of products, and it spurs growth. Railroads also stimulated the economy by spending huge amounts of money on steel, coal, timber, and other materials. So smaller railroad companies are consolidated and taken over by larger rail lines, and you start to see like a growth in the railroad economy. One of the most successful railroad consolidators is known as Cornelius Vanderbilt. So in 1869, he had purchased and merged 3 short New York railroads to form the New York City Central, running from New York City to Buffalo. So within 4 years, he had extended his control over the lines all the way to Chicago. And then he's able to offer the first direct rail service between New York City and Chicago. So by 1871, Vanderbilt had begun building New York's Grand Central Terminal, and he's known for that as well. And then, Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. So before the 1880s, each community sets its clocks by the sun's position at noon. All right. So different local times interfered with train scheduling, and at times it interfered with passenger safety. So sometimes you would have trains arriving on the same track at the same time, and you would have collisions because people would like schedule based on, their local times, and that obviously created some problems. So to make the rail service safer and more reliable, the American Railway Association divided the country into 4 time zones. So we're in the central time zone. You have the Pacific, the Eastern, Mountain time zone. And that is why we have those time zones specifically. And obviously, it's still kind of based on the sun's position, like to an extent, but it was a result of railway collisions. The federal government ratifies this change in 1918 and makes it official. So here's your mountain time, Pacific time, central time that we're in here in Arkansas, and then Eastern time. Sun rises in the east and sets in the west, so it's a lot later in the east than it is in the west. So to encourage railroad construction across the Great Plains, the federal government gave land grants to a lot of railroad companies. So the railroads then sold the land to settlers, real estate companies, and other businesses to raise money to build the railroad. Several railroads, including the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, received enough land to cover most of the cost of building their lines. The great wealth many railroad entrepreneurs acquired in the late 1800s led to accusations that they had built their fortunes by swindling investors and taxpayers, bribing officials, and cheating on their contracts and debts. So we call those people robber barons because we think that they stole their wealth. They didn't earn their wealth properly. And we look at them as being kind of corrupt, not really honest workmen. And there are many entrepreneurs in history that we look at and kind of deem them as robber barons. We also have what we know as captains of industry, and these people are, more honorable men who earn their wealth honestly. So bribery occurred pretty frequently, partly because the government helped fund the railroads. So some investors would, they made more money by acquiring government land grants than by operating the railroads. So they would just buy up these land grants and bribe members of Congress so they could get more grants and sell them off to make more money. So Jay Gould is one of the most notoriously corrupt railroad owners. He's known for doing this. We could consider him to be a robber baron. Then we get the credit mobilier scandal. Basically, corruption in the railroad industry becomes public in 1872 because of the credit mobilier scandal. It's basically a construction company that's set up by several stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad, including Oates Ames, who is a member of Congress. All the investors signed contracts with themselves, acting for both the Union Pacific and the credit mobilier, and it greatly overcharged the Union Pacific and added miles to the railroad construction. The investors made millions of dollars off of this scandal, but the railroad itself had used up all of its federal grants and was almost bankrupt. So they're essentially cheating the railroad and the government out of money for this. To convince Congress to give the railroad more grants, Ames sold to other members of Congress shares in the Union Pacific at a price well below their market value. So an angry associate of Ames sent a letter during the election campaign of 1872 to the New York Sun, basically listing everybody who accepted shares, including the Speaker of the House, James Blaine, and Representative James Garfield, who later becomes president. So no one has filed charges, no criminal or civil charges are filed against anybody. The scandal doesn't affect any elections, but it just makes us aware that there is a lot of bribing going on, and a lot of people are not being very honest about how they're running their businesses. So the Great Northern Railroad is built by James J. Hill. He operates the Great Northern Railroad from Wisconsin to Minnesota to Washington without any federal land grants or subsidies. This man is considered more of a captain of industry. He offers low fares to settlers who homesteaded along this route and sold homesteads to Norwegian and Swedish immigrants coming into the region. He hauled products in high demand in China to Washington for shipment, and then he would haul lumber and farm products back east. So instead of doing what most people were doing with their railroads and just hauling one way, he was hauling goods both ways. So he's making double the money. The Great Northern became the most successful transcontinental railroad and the only one that was not eventually forced into bankruptcy. So I'm going to stop here and we'll talk about big business and some other entrepreneurs in the next lecture.